Hello everybody, I am Slow Rider. This is part 2 of my European adventure. On this particular day in question, I left Rem and was heading east into Germany. Just a quick note, this is a voiceover because, as I mentioned in my last video, the audio didn't actually record for a few days. So apologies for that, but I'll do the best I can. The first port of call for this day was fuel, and I had actually set out to find a petrol station, and I was expecting to see this sort of relatively grand petrol station as you might find in the UK, but no, apparently in smaller villages and towns they have petrol stations attached to car dealerships and that sort of thing, which is interesting. As mentioned, I was heading east on this particular day. It was about 5 or 6 hours actual riding time, with obvious breaks roughly every hour to change batteries and have a drink and such like. Most of the riding was on fairly straight roads, even though I had decided to stay away from the motorways. This is essentially still northern France, and therefore suffers the problems mentioned last video with, obliteration. But there were some twisty bits, mostly coming in and out of towns and villages, and it was still better than travelling on the motorways, frankly, which would have been boring as hell. And to be fair, some of the scenery, well, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It was green, there were tree-lined roads, and yeah, it wasn't that bad. There was actually a pair of bikers at the hotel that night as well in Clem. I think they were headed to the south of France. It was a couple on one bike, so travelling, two up. But they were heading out on their holidays. They had taken the ferry option to come across the channel, and although they had travelled down the same day as me, they actually left a little bit earlier in the morning. Though in fairness, they arrived at the hotel earlier as well. I think I mentioned in my previous video, the French do have the tendency to put speed restrictions on some roads, which, I mean, in fairness, the bends are quite tight, but in the UK we would be still on 60 mile an hour or 50 mile an hour limits. The French seem to prefer 40 and 30 mile an hour in places. This particular day's riding was also one that was affected by me attending the Saddlebags social ride, more so because I threw that in at the last minute. But it meant I was mostly going with what the sat-nav said, which explains most of the straight roads, to be honest. But as we approached Germany, it got somewhat better. the day drew to an end, I came up to the campsite. It was near a little French village where apparently they've decided that those sort of bricks they were a mix between bricks and cobblestones. They weren't proper road bricks. Anyway, they were fun to ride on. But as you can see, this road actually wasn't so bad coming out of the town. The campsite itself was fairly average. The amenities were what you would expect from a modern campsite these days. They did provide me with a map, which you can see I've fitted into the phone mount. Unfortunately, the map didn't actually mark which way the one-way roads were, so I was kind of working things out as I went along, and I very nearly took a wrong turn, a not turn, you might say. There was a no entry there that I nearly went down and had to turn around. The little block there is the amenities block, washing up, toilets, etc., etc. The pitches were, well, I mean, they were flat enough, but this was the best of them, and there was quite a slope to get down to it, which is why I was so hesitant to actually get on the grass. And it was just a little bit bumpy as well. As you can see, it's not very easy to ride on there at all. But there were a couple of other bikers on the site, which it did make the evenings a little better. They were just parked over to the left here, and I gave them a wave as I was heading off, because we'd actually had quite a good chat. They had come from Rem, just as I had, but they had had an extra night to travel to this particular campsite, and they stopped at Metz on the way. But they were headed very broadly the same way that I was this day. I was just leaving a little bit earlier. I had quite a lot of miles to do, quite a lot of miles to cover. So I set out early to find another petrol station. The two of them had been on NC750s, which has basically what got us talking. And they agree they're wonderful bikes. One had the X, the adventure bike, and the other had the S, which was the street bike. Now here I had naturally forgotten which side of the road I was driving on, being British, and I don't even know how I'd done it. I'd been distracted by roadworks, I think, but I finally realised at this point that actually I was supposed to be on the right-hand side of the road, and I could just pull into the petrol station. And again, you'll note it's not exactly a standout petrol station, but it was easier to spot this time round. And of course, when I was fueled up, I had to find my way out of this town, and as picturesque as it was to look at, making my way through the little lane to get out of the town, I wasn't entirely happy with it, but at least it was one way. It's just coming up here on the left-hand side. There we go. Not the widest of roads, but at least it was one way, so I shouldn't have had too many things to worry about coming around here. Fortunately, it was a fairly short lane, and I was back on the main roads within a minute or so. After that, it was back out into the countryside and, on to the next point of interest. It was actually a lot hotter on this particular day, and yeah, I really was feeling it. I was drinking lots of water, but even then, I felt I was overheating quite a lot. It seemed like the typical European summer day. Unlike the British summer day, apparently it was raining quite a lot in the UK. The German roads really were proving to be much more curvy than the French roads had been, which was good for me, and although there weren't necessarily big views to be had down these roads, it was relatively picturesque, I think. So after a short amount of main road riding, 5-10 minutes maybe, it was time to pull off and head into a town called Speyer, which is to the southwest of Heidelberg. And there's a clue to what I was going to see in the video now. The Boeing 747 there. Speyer has what they call a Technik Museum, which is a museum of anything technical. So motorbikes, planes, cars, boats, submarines, and of course, spaceships.